Welcome back, half-century Trojans. Hope everybody had a nice lunch, and if you took a campus tour, a virtual tour of the Coliseum or the School of Cinematic Arts, or that specially curated Hidden Treasures tour, we hope you learned something new. Our next class for you today couldn't be more timely, especially given the social and political unrest that's gripped our nation over the last few years. Joining us now to discuss the research at USC's Safe Communities Institute is the Institute's director, a gentleman who we've heard from plenty of times before, Professor Errol Southers. Errol Southers is a professor of the practice in national and homeland security, the director of the Safe Communities Institute at USC, and the director of Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies at the USC Salk Price School of Public Policy. He is a former FBI special agent who has served in counterterrorism and public safety positions at every level of government. During his tenure as Deputy Director for Critical Infrastructure of the California Office of Homeland Security, he led the identification, prioritization, and protection of the state's potential terror targets, the nation's largest such data set. His work at USC spans so many fields, including counterterrorism, homegrown violent extremism, terrorist recruitment and radicalization, critical infrastructure protection, and community resistance to terrorism. After his presentation, Professor Southers will take questions from the audience, moderated by his colleague, Jesse Redd, Academic Program Specialist at the USC Safe Communities Institute. Once again, we remind everybody to please submit your questions at any time during the program by typing them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to bring to you Professor Southers.
Patrick, thank you very much. And to the half-century Trojans, I want to say it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. Thank you for allowing me to join you. I'm going to share some information about our center. As Patrick mentioned, I've been here now for quite some time, going on 18 years. I really do, despite the challenging and the seriousness of what I address, I really do have their dream spot at USC with regards to what I'm able to work on. So if we'll go to the next slide, I'll give you a very brief history of the Safe Communities Institute. We started as something called DCI back in the 1940s, the Delinquency Control Institute. And if any of you remember that, it was formed after what was called the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. And it was a joint effort to put law enforcement officers, social workers, and others, as you can see in a slide, in an education opportunity, in an education program at USC. Many of the chiefs that I've known over the years in agencies throughout LA County and throughout the United States went through our DCI program. It was sponsored by them, and it became a great feeder program for our school's masters in public administration, and many chiefs went on to become masters. So when you run into chiefs who tell you that they're Trojans, you'll probably have to ask them, did you go to DCI? And they'll probably say yes. But after that happened, Jack Knott, who was our dean and just left this past year to go to NYU, about maybe 8 years ago said, Errol, we need to revamp the program. It's gotten dated. No one uses the term delinquency control anymore. We're not going to focus on just gangs and juveniles and truancy and things like that. We need to have a more comprehensive program. So I met with a lot of the chiefs and some of the community representatives and said, how do we come up with a program that's more fitting the 21st century? And so about 5 years ago, we actually founded the Safe Communities Institute. We still call it formally, our title has to say formally DCI because we're endowed by an organization that has that title. We're now called the Safe Communities Institute, and we've taken a more comprehensive approach to public safety and violence prevention. Next slide. So our core, with all due respect, is violence prevention. And while we work on areas that Patrick just mentioned in homegrown violent extremism and national security, we're talking about public safety because we can't have a safe country if we don't have a safe community. And our education programs, my colleague, Jesse Redd, Jesse runs several programs throughout the year, a public safety leadership program in the fall and spring semesters, and then an executive leadership program in the summer when we can all get back to being not so socially distanced, where they come together for an entire week of an intensive program that addresses everything from homegrown violent extremism to human trafficking to cybersecurity to the deep dark web. I'm going to talk about our research efforts here in a moment, but most importantly, I do want to say we have a very strong relationship with the community around USC. as well as the nation and around the world. And I will talk about that as well, because it is very important for us to engage, to learn, to have conversations, and build relationships. Next slide. So the Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies program focuses on 3 different areas of extremist ideologies. The first one is race. And you see there we have Dylan Roof, and you remember the attack on the church in South Carolina several years ago. On the upper right, we have religion, and those were the 2 attackers in San Bernardino. And it is indeed a small world, because unfortunately, when that attack occurred that day, one of the first individuals killed was a colleague of mine who I met here at USC. USC, by the way, has the first Department of Homeland Security's Center of Excellence called CREATE. It is a Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events. It is a co-branded partnership between the Saul Price School of Public Policy and the Viterbi School of Engineering. And one of my colleagues at CREATE was one of the individuals who unfortunately was in San Bernardino that day and killed in that incident. And then we have issue-oriented ideologies, such as those who are anti-government, anti-abortion, anti-immigrant. You can almost call it the anti-category. And on the left there, you see 2 what we call sovereign citizens. Sovereign citizens is a movement in the United States that believes the United States government is not legitimate. Those 2 individuals, a father and son team who were traveling the country, killed a pair of officers in West Memphis, Arkansas, they got stopped by them and didn't know what they had. And unfortunately, they killed those 2 officers in that assault that day. And then on the right, we have the January 6th riots of the Capitol, again, a largely anti-government movement trying to stop the election certification or the Electoral College certification on January 6th. So we cover in the issue-oriented group a whole collection of diverse ideologies. Sometimes when you're dealing with violent extremists, you're looking at people or dealing with people who almost have a menu, and they select the ideologies that they like, and they go on with their lives, and that becomes their legitimizing ideology. Next slide. I was fortunate enough, it's very humbling to be at USC, and I'm just going to say this because I think it bears mention. I can't think of another university where you get to engage or complete a doctoral program, write your dissertation on homegrown violent extremism, publish a book in that area, and then have a studies area that's focused on it. And I always tell people who are interested in coming to USC, I'm living my dream. Because everything that I've wanted to work on my entire career is not only something that I get to focus on every day, it's become a full-blown formal studies program in our school. Because of that, I've testified in front of the full Congressional Committee on Homeland Security a number of times. The most memorable event was when I got to testify at the first and only hearing on the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013. If you'd like to see that testimony, it's called The Boston Marathon Bombings, A First Look. And one of the things that I had to emphasize that day to the committee was that, as I had their caption, the Boston Marathon bombings was a game changer. We had 2 individuals who had lived in the United States for 10 years before they decided to become operational and attack the marathon that day. It also was a game changer with regards to what we call soft targets. A marathon is an open event. It's not like protecting a government building or a power plant or a water treatment facility. How do you protect a marathon? And so we started taking a different look at what we call soft targets around the country as a result of this incident. Next slide. One of the other things that's happened over the years, and I was engaged in with CREATE, is a study of foreign fighters. So we had a number of young men, particularly from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, who had left here in the 2008, 2009, to fight for an Islamist group in Somalia called Al-Shabaab. What's really interesting about that was those same individuals some years later were leaving from Minnesota to go to Turkey and then to fight in Syria and Iraq for ISIS. So we had a study that was supported by the Department of Homeland Security, and we went there and did a qualitative field study to find out 2 things. Why would a Somali American leave to fight for ISIS? And most importantly, what kinds of programs could deter that kind of recruitment strategy? What you're looking at there are 10 young men in the lower left who were identified by the FBI and subsequently prosecuted. But I bring this slide to your attention because the young man at the top, Abdi Warsami, he was with the 3 others in the lower right. Those 4 guys were trying to leave the United States when they got caught by the FBI. And I just want to make sure I emphasize this point. Anybody can be radicalized. There's a program in Minneapolis called Kajug, and the program was an after-school program to help kids have alternatives for activities after school so they wouldn't be subjected to this kind of recruitment strategy. The program was so successful, it got an award from the FBI. Abdul Warsami spent time in that program several times a week because his uncle was a director. And Abdul Warsami was what we call the imam, if you will, of this group of four men that was going to lead the United States to fight. So here's a guy who's directly connected to a program to prevent violent extremism and recruitment, and he got radicalized and recruited. So it can happen to anybody. Next slide. We returned there 3 years later because we really understood now, based on the intelligence we were getting, we had turned off the faucet between Minnesota and Syria. We wanted to know why. Two huge programs there. One to the upper left is an indoor soccer program that we eventually took outside. And those kids were so poor there when I went there my first trip, they were indoors playing soccer, sharing shoes. So as a result, we were able to get them sponsored by the Minnesota United pro soccer team. And when I went back there a couple of years ago, they all had uniforms and warm-ups. Girls were playing in the league. It's a tremendous opportunity for kids to have another alternative to some other activities that would get them in trouble. In the lower right is our partner in Minnesota. His name is Muhammad Ahmed. Muhammad runs a cartoon called Average Muhammad. It's a cartoon series to fight against ISIS because he believed, I'll use his words, we should be educating kids at the age that they're watching SpongeBob. And it's been very successful. We have a very robust cybersecurity platform to protect it. And we get cyber attacked by ISIS quite frequently, so we know it's working because we've got their attention. Next slide. The project we did last year with the center at USC, a co-partner with the center at USC, the Center for Social Innovation, was called NDSC, or Neighborhood Data for Social Change. So one of the things that we understand is very important is when communities become engaged in identifying their problems, coming up with solutions, and helping to develop strategies. This whole program did just that. So we partnered with LAPD and a couple of other law enforcement agencies and gave people data so they could develop strategies to become safer. In just 2019, and by the way, this is on our site at the Price School, we've actually put this information into the hands of the public. And in 2019, we had over 150,000 people come to the site seeking information on data related to crime, employment, health, and a whole collection of activities that make for a safe community. We had 150,000 people come there in 2019. We finished the project last year, sponsored by Microsoft, and I'm happy to report we've just been renewed to do more work as it relates to neighborhood data for social change. One of the interesting things about that is we found that Black and brown Angelenos were stopped in South LA 3 to 4 times more than any place else in the city. However, we found that the Black and brown communities that they live in call for the police for calls for service more than anybody else. So I use that data quite often when we talk about defunding the police to say, let's make sure if we're going to be talking about reallocating resources that we don't take the resources from the communities who are calling for service from the law enforcement agencies. Next slide. One of the other projects we're working on there, and I'll give you the long scientific title, is the impact of building design attributes on occupant behavior in response to active shooter incidents in offices and schools. So unfortunately, we wrote a grant proposal to do research along with Viterbi School of Engineering and my partners there. We wanted to do research to determine, can we design a building to be inherently safer by the way the walls, the doors, the entrances, the access spaces are designed? When we wrote the proposal to the National Science Foundation, they came back with a reply and said, this looks really interesting, but we'd like you to focus on 2 other areas. Instead of focusing on terrorist attacks, we'd like you to focus on active shooter incidents in offices and schools. So here we are. What you're looking at in the lower left is an early rendition of these schools as we were trying to come up with a design. How do you design a typical school in America? You know, if you're like me from back east, schools in New Jersey in terms of physical layout look very different than schools in Los Angeles. So we had to come up with a generic school. We also had to come up with a generic office. But what makes this project really interesting is the fact that we're partnered with the Institute for Creative Technologies at USC, ICT, and their space is in virtual reality. So what we've done is we designed office and school spaces populated by avatars in the way of a shooter and the occupants. And then we take you, the subject, put you in the environment and immerse you in it to see how you respond to the shooter based on the way the building is designed. And we've already found some really interesting things already with regards to window placement, walls, doors, where people can come in, spaces that are controlled. It's really working out well. And we've published 2 articles already on this project, and we're looking obviously to do more work, as we've already had requests from law enforcement to use this as a training platform if they can going forward. And it really is interesting. We have a nice clip I won't show you today. We have a nice clip from NBC4. We put one of their journalists in it, and when she was going through the scenario, she started sweating because it was so realistic, and it works really well. Next slide. So as I work with violent extremists, and in the interest of full disclosure, when I was a police officer many years ago, I was a gang officer, and I realized that the best way to understand gangsters was from former gangsters. Well, believe it or not, the best way to understand terrorists and violent extremists are former violent extremists. I'm on a board of an organization called Life After Hate. It was formed largely by mostly neo-Nazis and white supremacists who have left the movement. There are 3 board members in this slide. Mubin Sheikh was a person who wound up in an undercover opportunity in Canada with Al-Qaeda. Tony McAleer in the lower left was the leader of a very large neo-Nazi movement in the Midwest. He's from Canada as well. And Angela King was a skinhead, then went on to become a neo-Nazi. Angela King was on the board as well. These are 3 of my colleagues. We have a counseling service and referral service for people who try to come out of the movement. And one of the things that we focus on is counseling in a family setting. And the priority with regards to that counseling is empathy. And most importantly, we understand if we can get people to disassociate themselves from violence, it's a win. If we get them to dissociate themselves from the ideology, it's like winning the Super Bowl. So we've had a number of successes over the years. We've become a national organization with a lot of traction. We just got a huge grant from the Department of Homeland Security to continue our work, and we're looking very forward to going forward with that. Jesse and I also work with a group called Parents for Peace. It is an international organization that does much the same thing in the way of counseling. And we have partners all over the world in Parents for Peace. And the focus there is we get parents of extremists, parents of violent extremists who are saying, I've got a son or daughter and I'm really challenged and worried about them. The sad part about this is what we've seen since the election at Parents for Peace are sons and daughters coming to us to say, my parents are the ones I think that are radicalized. What should I do? So we have a whole different dynamic and a whole other challenge now to face with regards to violent extremism in America and our counseling services and resources going forward. Next slide. Unfortunately, when we all decided to shelter in place after the pandemic hit a year ago, around March, we started to see an incredible uptick in hate crimes targeting Asians and Jews with regards to acts of anti-Semitism and violence around the country associated with the pandemic. Jesse and I started a link on our site called Virus of Hate, and we started tracking the hate crimes that were targeting largely Asians and Jews as being blamed for being the source of COVID-19. We regularly update this information to show where those events were happening. We would be giving presentations with regards to how people can be safer in environments, because there were certain environments that these incidents were happening, large retail spaces, pharmacies, those kinds of outlets, some public spaces. And the other thing we were doing on that site as well was actually identifying law enforcement responses to these threats and to these incidents across the country. We work on this project with the Shoah Foundation at USC and our larger Our larger hashtag is Stronger Than Hate, and we're working across the country and across the world because this is not, unfortunately, something that's singular to the United States. We've seen this kind of uptick in hate related to COVID across the world, and we're all working together to mitigate these kinds of incidents from happening. Next slide. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and the banner behind me, is the Lewis Registry. So we are very engaged in police reform. And as Patrick mentioned, I've served in 3 different law enforcement agencies over my career. And we're working on something called the Lewis Registry. And we have to have an acronym in law enforcement. So Lewis stands for Law Enforcement Work Inquiry System. It is going to be a national database documenting police officers that have been fired or resigned in lieu of misconduct. One of the challenges we have in law enforcement is that people who get fired typically go on to other departments. And you'll find that some of the incidents that are involving officers being accused of misconduct or in shootings that are somewhat questionable, they'll have long histories of complaints, long histories of even being fired at other agencies, and they move on because there is no national database. So we've been working with state legislators. In fact, Jesse and I did a presentation last month to the State Assembly Select Committee on Police Reform on Lewis. We've partnered with several congressional members on both sides of the aisle, and I'm very pleased to say that we have conducted a national survey. And in that survey, 80% of Americans said they would support a national database documenting police officers fired or resigned in lieu of misconduct. It was 74% Republicans, 76% independents, and 90% Democrats. So we stand on solid ground with regards to bipartisan support. We also have the support of community stakeholders. And as we're now branching out, we have had a number of volunteers that have come on board to help us as we're trying to get stood up here with the appropriate funding to run Lewis and actually tie it to some federal legislation that's in the works right now, where this will be the registry that everyone agrees is necessary. I'm also delighted to say we have a number of law enforcement partners on board. The Pac-12 chiefs and the UC system chiefs have volunteered to be our pilot group for this study, as well as we've partnered with the LA County chiefs and the major cities chiefs, Art Acevedo in Houston. That's the 69 largest police departments in the country. We'll be working with them. They all agree as chiefs that there are certain people that have issues that once they're fired, they don't want them working for them. And we're looking forward to this new initiative and getting it off the ground and making a difference with regards to building that bridge between law enforcement and the community. What better person when we talk about bridges other than Representative John Lewis? Next slide. Last but not least, it's all about community engagement. And you can see there, that's one of our sessions where we've had law enforcement, community, students, activists, faith-based groups in the room having that conversation that Americans always say they want to have, and it never seems to happen. So Jesse and I we like to be referred to as the hub and the wheel sometimes. We bring people to our center when we don't have to socially distance, and we have those conversations. We talk about the challenges. We talk about the differences. We talk about systemic racism. We talk about misogyny and the immigration challenges. We have those conversations with our partners so we can build those bridges. And it's worked out very well. And we are very, very pleased to be in that space when it comes to these kinds of challenges. Next slide. This last one shows the outreach we have globally. We are sponsored by the United States State Department. They have something called the IVLP, the International Visitors Leadership Program. So Jesse and I get to have colleagues come to visit us and a couple other entities in LA as they visit usually 3 or 4 cities in America. And I get to speak with violent extremist experts from their respective countries about what they're doing, their challenges, their best practices, and we get to share ours. On a good year, we usually have at least one delegation per month. It's been an incredible opportunity to build bridges. As a result of their work, I'm also on the faculty at the University of Paris, where I've been teaching now for 3 years because of this relationship with IVLP. And then I also teach in Israel. I've been teaching in Israel for 14 years at the Interdisciplinary Center there. So the State Department has been a fantastic partner. I can't champion their work enough. I've had a number of former students that have gone to work at State, and I'm really happy to tell you this opportunity exists because one of my former students said, "Hey, we'd like to give a lecture at the State Department. You come back and do that?" When I gave that lecture that afternoon, their leader, I should say, their department head for counterterrorism said, how'd you like to give these talks around the world? And I said, well, I already do. He goes, no, for us. And so here we are. And it's worked out really well. Next slide. So I'm going to stop there. I hope this has been useful. If I seem a little animated, it's because I love what I do. I don't know what it's like to have a job. I guess people have jobs because a job to me is when you do things you don't want to have to do. It's hard for me to turn this off. I have the best partner in the world in Jessie Red. And yes, I recruited Jessie. She's a Trojan. I waited for a couple of years to get her. She did her master's at Florida International University. I'll date myself here, the original Wizard of Oz, when everybody thought the wizard was this grand guy and he ran this incredible place called Oz. And at the end of the movie, you find out it's this little guy standing behind the curtain. Well, Jessie and I are the two people behind the curtain. But really, she's the wizard. She makes all of this work. I couldn't have a better partner. I want to thank Saul Price School of Public Policy for everything they do to support us. And I want to thank all of you for your time. And we'll just open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Southers, for those kind words and that excellent overview of the Safe Communities Institute. So let's jump right into a few questions. You spoke about the Lewis Project. Can you tell us what the next steps are?
Well, the next steps are going to be creating the database. So as you know, we have several volunteers now that are going to be populating the database with information regarding the officers. What we're really doing, it's almost like Noah building the ark. When he was building the ark, it wasn't raining. So we're building this database understanding that there'll have to be certain legislative measures that go along with it. So that's the reason that we're working with the state and the federal government on those legislative measures that are going forward. But most importantly, we're trying to obviously secure funding so that we can set up the cybersecurity infrastructure for this database. This is something where law enforcement agencies will share information, and that has to be, I'll just say, we need military grade security for that. However, this will also be a database open to the public so that there's a public facing element as well. So the next step is the cybersecurity infrastructure for the database and the legislative measures that will track alongside of this at the state and federal level.
Excellent. Thank you. A database is much needed, as we've heard, on many levels. So I'm excited to be working on this with you. The next question from the audience is referring to your Minneapolis studies. So why has this become the center of development for violent extremism?
That's a great question. And the answer we got to that question was really interesting. As I've been to Minneapolis now many times in the last 6 years, the first question I had was, why would someone from sub-Saharan Africa settle in Minneapolis? And I got to tell you, whenever we went there, whenever the temperature got in double digits, we were ready to work in a t-shirt. But I will say this, they said because when they got here, Minneapolis was the most welcoming city in the country. It seemed like everybody there was very friendly and welcomed them. Well, as Somalis came and settled in America after spending usually 7 to 8 years in a refugee camp, typically in Kenya, the word got out and they started migrating to Minneapolis and started working there. What's interesting then is the opportunists came in from groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS and started asking the questions that got them recruited. You're in America now. How does racism feel to you? You come from a country where you didn't even understand what racism was. Why do people hate you because you're Muslim? Why do people hate you because you're Somali American? Are you having opportunities for jobs? Are you getting an education? Those kinds of conversations tended to be really interesting for people who were now being convinced that being in America wasn't a great deal and that Americans actually hated them. And they recruited these young men to go back and fight in Somalia and then years later to fight for ISIS. Fortunately for us, what we found now, the reason that pipeline is shut down is because they have assimilated. We find that they have incredible graduation rates. They're going on to college. I have never seen a community more engaged in the political process. It seems everybody runs for everything from school board to Congress. And the other thing I want to mention is we did something there called Mosaic of Engagement. Everything we do in law enforcement and national security is built on negatives: number of arrests, number of prosecutions, number of thwarted terror plots. We flipped the script in Minneapolis and said, let's start measuring high school graduation rates. Let's start measuring the college entrance rates in Minneapolis. Let's start measuring employment. Let's start measuring how many people are entering public service, being elected. When we started doing that, we started emphasizing the positives. All of that negative activity started to go down. And as a result now, we don't have that pipeline of foreign fighters leaving Minnesota to fight for another country.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have some great questions coming in. So the next one, we're gonna, still on the same topic. What do you recommend that people do when they discover that a family member or friend has joined a domestic terrorist group?
That's a great question. So I'm going to give you three things that make radicalization happen. You've got an alienated individual. And by that, I don't mean mental illness. I mean a person who feels like they're not in the mainstream. Somehow their views are different. Somehow they feel like they're a victim. They just don't feel like they're a part of the greater good or the greater community. The second element is a legitimizing ideology. This is where you have to be really careful. You can never put these ideologies into one basket. They're not monolithic. You know, as I mentioned previously, some of these individuals, it's like sitting down in a restaurant with a menu. And they check off all the things that they like. With all due respect, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, one of the Boston Marathon bombers, was a jihadist. He was also a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier. So it all depends on what you feel you can address or what you feel addresses your issues. But the last component after the alienated individual and the legitimizing ideology is the enabling community. And that's where you come in. These people don't live in a vacuum. So most importantly, let someone know. Groups like Life After Hate, Parents for Peace, those are organizations where we actually work to counsel people out of those movements. But you've got to let someone know, because we found our success rate is when people self-report, we're able to work in a community setting, meaning a setting usually of the initial family, to help them get out of that or help disengage from that environment. I do want to share with you, I mean, we've modeled something that I learned in Berlin. There's a project there called Exit Germany. They've been quite successful with it. It bridges all of the ideologies. In fact, we were using a platform in Berlin to address returning foreign fighters who were jihadists. We're using that same platform to address former neo-Nazis, and it doesn't matter what the ideology is. It's the process that works, but you've got to let someone know. As you know, years ago, and I don't know the current statistic, 40% of the terror plots that we thwart in the United States are because people called the FBI, because they called law enforcement. Knowing that someone's in a violent extremist organization or domestic terror organization is the same thing. You've got to let someone know. Let people who are trained, who have the expertise and experience deal with this, and they can work with you or whomever to help address the issue.
Thank you. So we have another question from Miss White, and she would like your opinion on the Capitol riots regarding the group at the true core of the incident.
Well, that's a great question. The first thing I want to say is that much like Charlottesville in 2017, there's not really one group at the core. What you've got is a very diverse collection of organizations and individuals who coalesced under one banner that day, much like we did in Charlottesville. So understand, as I talked about earlier, not putting these ideologies in one box. While we can all say that they may be Trump supporters, there are some who are white supremacists. There are some who are anti-government. There are some who are anti-vaxxers. There are some who are anti-immigrant. The banner that day was the United States government was the target. And so that's largely what's driving it. The unfortunate thing is that we've had an administration over the last several years that these folks have felt championed by in both rhetoric and action. So they're emboldened. And last but not least, when COVID put us all at home back in March, many of these organizations use that as a time to recruit, saying that we have government overreach. COVID is a hoax. You shouldn't have to wear a mask. I shouldn't have to lose my job. I want to go to the restaurant. I want to go to the gym. When you saw some of the Capitol protests around the country, like in Michigan and Virginia, those extremist organizations were recruiting under the banner of anti-government. So while we can all identify people who were in the January 6 riots as being from a whole host of different ideologies, most importantly, what was the driver that day was anti-government. I mean, let's face it, they were there to stop the certification of the Electoral College. However, you had people there who were from groups that we all know that have espoused a whole collection of ideologies, but the anti-government umbrella is what was driving it that day, and that's largely responsible. But let's not sugarcoat anything. We are talking about groups that have been emboldened over the last 4 years and felt that they had a green light to operate with impunity for that time period, and that's why that happened. So I am hoping going forward that we have nothing less than a 9/11 style commission to look into it. And I'm also hoping going forward that we address those elements of our public safety, meaning law enforcement, and our national security apparatus, where we believe those kinds of people have infiltrated for many years.
Thank you. And another excellent question, changing gears a little bit from Ms. Sarah Jane Betji. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So this is about defunding the police. And basically, what are your opinions as far as the problem of defunding the police? So she says the number of police retiring. She's wondering if we are doing anything to study the effect of this and what the future holds for law enforcement.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm on the USA Today opinion board of contributors. I wrote an article about not defunding the police, and I'll tell you why. However, I'm a staunch advocate, obviously, of police reform, or else we wouldn't be championing something like the Lewis Registry. So the challenges with, and I'll say it this way, you know, for many years when we've had these shootings, particularly of people of color who are unarmed, the response from law enforcement is we need more training. And then we'll have another shooting and we need more training. It wasn't until people started saying defund the police that it seems that we got everybody's attention. So when you're talking about budget, we get people's attention. Going forward, what needs to happen, in my opinion, are that as we reallocate resources, we really do send funding to the people with the talent, the expertise, and experience that can address the problems. In the interest of full disclosure, I was a drill instructor in the police academy. I've trained thousands of officers. We spend 90% of the time training people. For that 3% of the time, they have to decide whether or not they use deadly force. When 90% of the calls they're going to get are going to be calls where that's not even an issue. The other challenge we have is, as I talked about previously, is triaging calls. Do we need a stranger with a firearm showing up for a call because the police got called because the person's upset because their neighbor's sprinkler got their car wet? Do we need that? So going forward, as you mentioned in the question about retirements and resignations, here's the challenge, is that we, in our world with the Lewis Registry, we want to make sure that people who get fired don't go someplace else. Policing is a culture. There's a culture, and trust me, as someone who's been in 3 agencies, I can tell you that culture is very real. And it takes more than policy changes. The joke in law enforcement is that police departments eat policy for breakfast. So we need more than policy changes. We need real leadership. We need real reallocation of resources. And I've often told communities, don't go after the chief of police when you're upset. Go after the mayor or the city council who appointed the chief. We need to make people accountable. And I think that's what's going to help us going forward.
Thank you for that. And we have time for one more question. So the last one is a general, what keeps the Safe Communities Institute the busiest right now?
Oh boy, Jesse, I should let you answer that question. I'll say this. Prior to COVID, Jesse and I had more requests for a presentation that we do on homegrown violent extremism and protecting houses of worship. Last year, we spent more time in synagogues and churches giving lectures than any place else. They were calling us in droves because we had a spate of houses of worship, not just in America, but around the world, that got targeted by violent extremists. So that would have been the answer then. What keeps us busiest now? obviously the Lewis Registry as we try to work on police reform, and also the virus of hate, because it hasn't gone away. So I will just say hate crimes and hate incidents keep us very busy. We have, and I have some, really good stories that we have with other programs we didn't talk about today for our kids in elementary school and other places. But I will say that hate crimes and violent extremism, as well as police reform, is what's keeping us the busiest right now. And we're really happy to be doing that work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Southers, for just that overview of the Safe Communities Institute and all the work that you are doing. So
Thank you, Jesse.
And we will pass it back to Patrick.
Thank you. And thank you to Jesse. Thank you to you and Professor Southers. Great to see you again. You and your colleagues are performing such an invaluable service for our country. And you bring such pride to the university. I mean, so often we talk about all the great things USC is doing in medicine and business and the social sciences and the arts. And to have this sort of work going on constantly at USC, and not just in the wake of what happened January 6th or back in 2017, this has been going on for decades. I mean, even to the point where our very own Lorna Reed, one of our past presidents of the Half Century Trojans, she worked in that former DCI office when she was on campus. So it's such a point of pride for our university, and we're really grateful that you've spent time with us here today. So thank you again. Continue to keep us safe in so many regards and be well, and we'll hope to see you again soon.